The part of your brain that registers physical injury does not know the difference between a broken bone and being deliberately ignored by someone you love. The same neurons, the same region, which means every time they went silent, the ache you felt afterwards was not weakness. Your body was registering an injury. Take a slow breath. We have time. You have probably spent years trying to explain this to yourself in 1,000 quiet, exhausted ways. A behavior you excused, reframed, defended to other people, defended to yourself. A behavior that felt so much worse than it seemed like it should. A behavior that most of the world is still willing to call minor. The silent treatment. There are two things I want to hold for the second half of this, and I want you to know they are coming. One is a specific place and a specific year where this technique was actually invented, documented, verifiable, with the name of the man who designed it and the institution that paid him to do so. The other is a finding about why the people who suffer under this behavior most are often the exact people who stay inside it longest. When we get there, both will change the way you understand every episode of it you ever lived through, including maybe the ones you have been blaming yourself for. For now, just rest. You do not have to do anything with this tonight. The understanding can come slowly. For most of your life, you have probably been told a version of the same story about silence. That it is immature but not dangerous. That people need space. That some people are just bad at conflict. That you have to give them time. That if you loved them, you would understand. That your reaction to it, the nausea, the spiraling, the desperate apologies you sent to break the quiet, was the problem. That you were too sensitive, that you were making a small thing into a big thing. You were told this by friends and family members who did not know any better. You were told this by therapists who did not know any better. Maybe you were told this by the person who was doing it to you. In the rare moments they broke silence long enough to explain why the silence was justified. And the story almost worked. It almost fit. Because there is a version of silence in relationships that is healthy. Someone who says, "I am overwhelmed and I need 1 hour," and then returns in 1 hour. That person is regulating, not punishing. That is a human being honest about their limits. What you lived through was something different. You knew it was different because your body knew it was different. Your chest did not feel like someone was regulating their nervous system. It felt like something was being done to you. It felt like a cage. You were right. And here is the part the story never had a good answer for. If the silent treatment was merely immature, or merely a communication issue, or merely the way some people cope, why did it hurt so much? Why could you not let it go? Why did apologizing, even for things you had not done, feel like relief? Why, the moment it ended, did you feel the exact chemical high you would feel from ending a physical threat? Why did your body know, again and again, that something terrible had just happened? Because something terrible had just happened. Your body was reading the situation accurately. The explanations that kept telling you otherwise, the ones that framed your response as the issue, those explanations were wrong. And the research that proves they were wrong has been sitting there since 2003. In that year, a team of researchers at the University of California, Los Angeles, Naomi Eisenberger, Matthew Lieberman, and Kipling Williams, put people into an fMRI machine and watched what happens to the human brain when it is excluded. The setup was almost painfully simple. Participants believed they were playing an online ball-tossing game with 2 other people. They threw the virtual ball. The other players threw it back. Everything normal. Everything fine. And then, partway through, the other 2 players just stopped throwing to the participant. No reason given, no explanation, just silence from the game. The participant sat there, ignored for the rest of the scan. And here is what the researchers found. The brain region that lit up during exclusion was the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the same region that lights up during physical pain. Not similar, the same. Take a slow breath. Let that land. The region your brain uses to register that you have been hurt. The alarm system that tells you something in your body has just been damaged. The one that shouts, "Stop! Attend to this. Something is wrong." That system does not have a separate channel for social injury. It uses the same wiring, the same machinery, the same ancient alarm, which means when someone you loved stopped speaking to you, went cold, refused to acknowledge your presence in the room, walked past you like you were not there, your brain interpreted that at the level of pure neurology, the way it would interpret a wound. And it gets stranger. The participants in that study knew, some of them, that the game was probably not real. Later studies replicated the effect when participants were explicitly told the other players were controlled by a computer. Zadro, Williams, and Richardson published that result in 2004. The title of their paper was, roughly, "How Low Can You Go?" The answer they found was astonishingly low. Being excluded by software you know is software still threatens your sense of belonging, your self-esteem, your sense of control, your sense of being real in the world. If being ignored by a piece of code can do that to a stranger in a lab, stay with this. Then you can begin to imagine what being ignored by the person whose opinion mattered most to you, in your own home, for days at a time, was doing to your body. It was doing exactly what it felt like it was doing. That was not your imagination. That was your biology. And there is one more finding from this line of research worth hearing, because it tells you something specific about how deep the wiring really goes. In 2007, two researchers named Karen Gonçalves and Kipling Williams ran a version of the experiment in which participants were told, before the game began, that the people about to exclude them were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Which is to say, the participants knew, going in, that the people ignoring them belonged to a group they openly despised. A group whose rejection, by any rational measure, should have felt like a compliment. And the participants were still hurt. Not a little. Measurably. To nearly the same degree as participants who had been ignored by neutral strangers. Their sense of belonging dropped. Their self-esteem dropped. Their sense of meaningful existence dropped. The researchers titled the paper with a phrase that stayed with me. "The Klan won't let me play." The point being, the part of the brain that registers being ignored does not care whether the people ignoring you are admirable. It does not care whether rejection by them should, by any reasonable logic, feel like validation. It registers the ignoring, it delivers the wound, and it does so before the conscious mind has any chance to intervene with a reasonable argument, which tells you something specific about the architecture of this injury. It is not something you can reason your way out of. It is not something you can logic your way past. It is not something where, if you had just reminded yourself often enough that the person ignoring you did not deserve the power to hurt you, the hurt would have subsided. That is not how this wiring works. This wiring is older than logic. It is older than judgment. It is older than the frontal lobe. Which is why, for so many years, you could not talk yourself out of how much it hurt. You were trying to use one part of the brain to override a much older, much deeper part. The older part wins. Every time. And the reason it went that deep is worth understanding, because it explains something specific about why you could not just shake it off, no matter how many people told you to. Kipling Williams, the social psychologist who has done more ostracism research than anyone alive, developed a model for what being ignored actually threatens. It is not one thing. It is not just loneliness. It is four things at once, all striking the same person in the same moment. The first is belonging. The sense that you are part of a bond, that someone out there sees you and keeps you in mind, that you are not alone in the dark. Silence removes that in a second. The person who was there is still physically there, but the emotional presence is gone. You are in a room with them, and you are also nowhere. The second is self-esteem, because the silence is almost never random. It comes after something. After a question, after a small assertion, after an honest feeling expressed at the wrong moment. Which means the silence seems to communicate, without words, that you specifically are not worth engaging with. That something about you is the reason the engagement stopped. And so the erosion begins, not in one large blow, but in 1,000 small withdrawals, each one teaching you that your presence is not quite tolerable. The third is control. You cannot end it. Only they can end it. They know this. You know this. The asymmetry is the whole point. Nothing you say, no apology, no gesture, no performance of remorse changes anything until they decide to allow it to change. You are reduced, in that moment, to waiting. And human beings, as it turns out, find the loss of even small amounts of control catastrophic. There is a reason solitary confinement is considered a form of torture. There is a reason hostages develop specific psychological syndromes. Not being able to act on your own situation for hours, for days, wears something down in you that is not easy to describe. The fourth is meaningful existence, and this is the one that is hardest to talk about, because it is the one that cuts deepest. When you are being ignored by someone who claims to love you, not turned away from, not argued with, but rendered invisible, your brain begins to ask a question it was never designed to ask. Am I real? Am I here? Does my being here matter to anyone? You can feel yourself, for hours, becoming less solid. All four of these needs, belonging, self-esteem, control, meaningful existence, get struck at once, not in sequence, not one at a time, all at once. Which is why the silent treatment does not feel like one pain. It feels like every pain the nervous system has, compressed into a single, silent room. And here is what this means for you. If you have spent years trying to figure out why your response to it was always so much bigger than the behavior seemed to warrant. You felt it that big because it was that big. The behavior strikes more of you than any single word ever could. You were not overreacting. The architecture of what you were enduring was almost perfectly engineered to do what it did. And that last phrase, almost perfectly engineered, is not a metaphor. There is research on this that is hard to read even when you are trained to read it. In 2010, Brock Bastian and Nick Haslam ran a study on the psychological effects of being ostracized, using Williams's cyberball paradigm and some variants of it. What they were looking for was not mood, not sadness, not anxiety. They were looking for something more specific. They asked the participants, after being ignored, to rate themselves on a scale of traits associated with being essentially human, the qualities that mark us as people rather than animals, rather than objects. People who had just been ignored rated themselves as less human. Not less happy. Less human. Read that again, if it helps. The effect was measurable. It was repeatable. It showed up across studies. The experience of being deliberately excluded, even briefly, produced in the excluded person a kind of quiet collapse in their own sense of full humanity. They felt more like an object. They felt more like a thing. They felt less like a person. This is not a poetic observation. This is a dependent variable in a peer-reviewed experiment. And if a few minutes of ostracism by strangers in a lab can produce that, take a slow breath, then imagine what days, weeks, years of episodic silence from the most important person in your life did to your sense of being a real human being in the world. The confusion you felt about yourself, the way you lost track of what you actually thought, the way you started to doubt whether your feelings were even yours, the way you would look at your own hands sometimes and feel a strange disconnect. That was not you losing your mind. That was a specific, documented neurological response to a specific kind of psychological injury. What they were doing to you was striking directly at the part of you that knew you were real. And here is the part I want to hold your attention for, the part I have been promising since the beginning. Because before you can understand what was done to you, you have to understand where the technique came from. And where it came from, who designed it, what they designed it to do, what they said, about why. Changes everything about how you understand the episodes you lived through. It turns out the silence you remember was not improvised. It had engineers. The silent treatment was not invented in modern relationships. It was not a communication habit your partner picked up from their family, or a coping style that emerged from emotional overwhelm. It has a specific origin, a specific date, a specific place, a specific person who designed it. In the early 1820s, in Auburn, New York, a prison warden named Elam Linds took over a facility that had been experimenting with a particular form of punishment. The experiment was silence. Complete, enforced, absolute silence. Prisoners were not allowed to speak to each other at work, not allowed to speak at meals, not allowed to speak in their cells, not allowed to look at each other in the hallways. They were forbidden to write letters home. They were forbidden to receive visitors. They were called by numbers, not names. They ate facing the same direction, in long rows, so that no eye contact between them was possible. They marched, and this is the detail that stayed with me. With one hand on the shoulder of the man in front of them, heads turned sideways toward the guard, eyes down. The posture was called lockstep. It was designed, specifically, so that a guard could spot whispering at a glance. Every movement of the prisoner's body was choreographed to prevent the possibility of a human exchange. And the goal, stated openly by Linds and the administration in their own documents, was to destroy the prisoner's sense of self. That is a direct paraphrase. The architects of the system believed that the self, the identity, the personality, the internal story of being someone, was the thing that had to be broken in order for the prisoner to be rehabilitated. And they believed silence, and specifically the silence of being ignored by everyone around you, was the most effective tool for breaking it. More effective than whipping, more effective than chains, more effective, in their opinion, than physical punishment of any kind, because it went deeper. And here is what that means for you. If you have ever wondered why the silence always felt like it went somewhere physical, punishment could not reach, there is a reason. Professional institutions with deliberate architects and documented design intent chose this method over whipping because they believed, and the historical record suggests they were right, that it was a more complete destruction of the person. They called it, in the language of the time, the silent system. Later it became known as the Auburn system. It was copied across the United States through the 1800s. It was exported to Europe. The specific technique of enforced silence as punishment became so widespread and so culturally recognized as a form of control, that when ordinary people began using it on each other, in homes and in schools and in churches, they called it by its institutional name. The silent treatment. That is where the phrase came from. It was a prison technique first. And now, I want you to sit with what that actually means. Because everything you lived through, every cold morning, every car ride where the other person looked straight ahead, every dinner where you could hear yourself chewing, every night you fell asleep while they faced the wall, every episode of it was not a mystery. It was not a quirk. It was not just how they coped. It was a technology of control, with a design history that was chosen by professional institutions over physical violence because it worked better at breaking people. Which means everything you just heard looks different now, because when you think about the last time it happened to you, and you remember how you felt afterwards, and you remember the voice in your head that said, "Something is really wrong, and I cannot explain why it hurts this much," that voice was not being dramatic. That voice was recognizing, without the language, that you were on the receiving end of a system that was designed by cold and deliberate people in the year 1821 to do exactly what it did. You can rest here for a moment. We have time. So what does it cost when this becomes a pattern in your life rather than a single bad episode? The research on this is unfortunately clear. The psychologist John Gottman, who spent 40 years watching married couples in his Seattle laboratory, identified stonewalling, the formal name for the silent treatment, as one of the 4 communication behaviors that most reliably predict divorce. The others are criticism, contempt, and defensiveness. He called them the 4 horsemen. He and his team could watch a couple argue for 15 minutes, and by tracking these 4 patterns, predict whether they would still be married in 5 years with accuracy that surprised other researchers in the field. Stonewalling, the silent treatment, the cold shoulder, whatever you call it, the research tracks it, and the research is damning. Relationships that feature it regularly do not usually recover. The reason is not moral. The reason is mechanical. Because each episode of silence is an injury, not a minor one, a real one. And injuries compound. The trust erodes. The body of the person being ignored becomes hyper-vigilant. They start to flinch at the small signs of the behavior coming. They start to change their own behavior, preemptively, to avoid triggering it. And they stop being themselves inside the relationship. Paul Schrott, a communication researcher at Texas Christian University, conducted a meta-analysis of 74 studies covering more than 14,000 participants. He was looking at what is called the demand-withdraw pattern, the cycle in which one partner presses for communication and the other goes silent. He found that the pattern is associated across cultures with lower relationship satisfaction, less intimacy, poorer communication generally, higher rates of anxiety and depression, and physical health decline. And crucially, the damage was not contingent on which partner was doing which thing. The pattern itself was the problem. The silence itself was the problem. And the physical health decline is not a metaphor. When a body is subjected repeatedly to a stressor it cannot resolve through action, the stress response system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is just a long name for the way your body releases cortisol and adrenaline under threat, does not turn off the way it is supposed to turn off. It stays partially activated. It keeps the body in a low, chronic state of alarm. And over months and years, that chronic activation does what chronic activation does. Immune function declines. Sleep fragments. Digestion becomes unreliable. The body becomes inflamed in ways that do not have an obvious cause. The work of John and Julie Gottman actually measured this in their laboratory. partners in stonewalling relationships would, during conflict discussions, reach heart rates above 100 beats per minute. Essentially, the physiological profile of someone being chased by a predator, except they were just sitting on a couch next to the person they had once chosen as their safest place in the world. That physiological flooding does not stop the moment the silent treatment stops. It keeps running in the background. For years, sometimes. And here is what this means for you. If you have spent the last several years trying to figure out why you feel so depleted, so emptied out, so chronically uncertain about who you even are anymore, there is nothing broken in you. What broke was the environment you were inside of, a pattern that, in the scientific literature, has been shown to produce exactly what you are experiencing. The exhaustion has a mechanical explanation. Your nervous system was activated over and over by a threat you could not resolve through action because the resolution was entirely under someone else's control. A system held in that state for that long produces depletion. That is what depletion is. The confusion has the same shape. What happens to a human mind when it is repeatedly struck at the level of meaningful existence, without warning, by someone it has no option but to remain close to, is confusion. You did not generate that confusion. The situation generated it using your mind as the instrument. The self-doubt was the dehumanization research predicting itself, arriving on time, in exactly the way the studies said it would arrive. You were not losing yourself. You were being worn down by a specific pattern that has been measured again and again and shown to wear people down in exactly the ways you have been worn down. If this is your experience, and you will know if it is, this is the part that matters most. It was not you. It was what was happening to you. I want you to rest for a moment with something very specific, because this is the part where the science and your actual life stop being separate things. If you grew up with this, if the silent treatment was the way disagreement happened in your home when you were 4 years old, 7 years old, 12 years old, then your nervous system is carrying information you never chose to carry. When a parent goes silent on a child in distress, the parent is teaching that child something their body will hold forever. And if it was done to you, then the thing your body learned, before you had the language for it, was this: that love can disappear without warning. That the person who was supposed to be the ground beneath you could, at any moment, decide you did not exist. You could not metabolize that. There is no version of 4 years old that can understand the silent treatment as a choice the adult is making. You could only understand it as something about yourself. That your presence must have become unbearable. That your need must have become too much. That your existence must have become the thing that caused the love to stop. A child's brain is not yet capable of holding the idea that a parent can be wrong. That capacity develops later, much later, and in many people it never fully develops at all. When your parent withdrew, your developing brain did the only thing it could do, which was to take the withdrawal as a feedback signal about your own worth. You rehearsed your behavior, your needs, your expressions, looking for what must have been wrong. You became, in the language of attachment research, anxiously attuned, a term that sounds gentle, but describes something closer to a permanent vigilance. The research on this is consistent. Adults who experienced emotional withdrawal from caregivers as a form of discipline show, across studies, higher rates of insecure attachment, a lower capacity to regulate their own emotions, a heightened sensitivity to rejection, and a tendency to replay the same pattern later in life, sometimes as the person being withdrawn from, sometimes as the person withdrawing. The psychologists Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary, in 1995, described the need to belong as one of the most fundamental human motivations, on a level with food and shelter. When that need is violated repeatedly in childhood, the violation shapes the architecture of how the adult will later love. You carried that into the adult relationships you chose. Not because you wanted to, because the nervous system remembers. Which is why, when the silent treatment showed up in your adult life, it did not feel like something new. It felt like something old, something almost recognizable, something you had lived through before but could not name. You were not imagining that recognition. You were right. If what I am describing feels less like your partner and more like the house you grew up in, what you are recognizing has a name: childhood emotional neglect. It has its own long hour on this channel. It will be there whenever you need it. And there is a particular cruelty embedded in this, which I want to name before we move on. The people who would be most wounded by the silent treatment in adulthood are often the exact people who were trained, from childhood, to tolerate it, to accommodate it, to read it as normal, to not recognize it as the wound it is. The wiring that made you feel it so deeply is the same wiring that made you stay inside it so long. That is, when you see it clearly, not a failure on your part. It is a mechanism working exactly as it was designed to work. So what does it actually give you to know this? This is where I want to be careful, because there is no clean narrative here where knowing the mechanism magically makes the wound stop aching. The wound is real. The injury was real. And the brain remembers what the brain remembers. But knowing changes something anyway. It changes something specific. When you understood the silent treatment as your own failure, as evidence that you were too needy, too sensitive, too much, too little, too whatever, the pain of it had nowhere to go. It turned inward. It became part of the story you told yourself about why you were the problem. And the story locked you in place. When you understand it as a documented, designed, measurable form of injury, not one you imagined, not one you deserved, not one that reveals something defective about you, but one that struck your brain in the specific places your brain was most vulnerable to being struck, something shifts. The pain does not disappear, but it stops meaning what you thought it meant. And there is one more finding here that is worth holding. When researchers looked at who leaves relationships in which the silent treatment is regularly used, they found something that, at first, seems paradoxical. It was not the people with the highest pain tolerance who stayed longest. The research suggests it was often the people with the lowest self-esteem who stayed. The people who had more self-esteem were more likely to leave. Because self-esteem, in this specific research context, appears to function as a kind of protective mechanism, one that allows the person to recognize the behavior as unacceptable and to act on that recognition. The people who stayed were not weak. They were being protected, in reverse, by a wounded self that kept telling them they did not deserve better. Which means, if you are still in it, or if you have only recently gotten out, or if you are still trying to decide whether what you lived through actually counted as abuse, and you have been wondering why it took you so long to see, the reason is not a failure in you. The reason is that the injury itself made the seeing harder. The mechanism of the harm includes the inability to recognize the harm, and that is why this hour, tonight, might actually matter. Because what knowing does, quietly over time, is it gives the recognition back. Not all at once, not perfectly, but it begins to return to you the ability to look at what happened and see it clearly. Not as a failure of love on your part, not as a coping strategy that was no one's fault, but as a specific kind of injury done by a specific kind of technique. And the ache you felt was the most accurate reading your body could have given you. All the years you were told you were too sensitive, your body had been right. You were paying attention. So come back with me for just a moment to where we started tonight, to the morning after a silence, the way you would wake up and the first thing you would feel, before your eyes even opened, was the weight of it. The weight of not knowing if they would look at you today. The weight of trying to remember what you had done. The weight of going through the day with half your attention turned inward, rehearsing apologies for something you could not even name. You know that feeling. Your body knows that feeling. Tonight, for the first time, maybe, you know something else. That the weight was real. That the wound was real. That the ache you felt afterwards was your body telling you the truth about what had happened to you, not your body failing to cope. Something was done to you, not something about you. And you can carry that small, quiet sentence, if you want, into whatever comes next. Into the next conversation. Into the next morning. Into the next moment of quiet in a room where you are trying to remember who you are. If this found you tonight, and something in it was useful, and you want more of this kind of understanding, the kind that meets you where you actually are, the door on this channel stays open. Come back when you need to. Subscribe if it feels right. You do not have to do anything tonight. And for now, let the room settle around you. Let your hands soften. Let your jaw unclench if you can feel it holding something. The warmth of the blanket, the weight of the pillow, the dark at the edges of the window, the air moving slowly in, the air moving slowly out, the whole night ahead of you, and no one asking anything of you in it, just the quiet of being alone, in a way that is not being ignored, but being at rest. You can sleep now.